Welcome, everybody. I'm Mary Anne Mohanraj, and I'm here for the Speculative Literature Foundation's panel on writing in shared worlds. I'm here with four lovely authors. In alphabetical author by first name, I have David Levine. Gosh, I had a moment there was like, what is the alphabetical order? Okay, I got it. David Levine, who is perhaps best known for Arabella of Mars, his one of his standalone novels, or I guess it's part of a series. But he's here today repping Wildcards, George R.R. Martin's shared world that I also write in, along with Walter. So that's David. These are going to be very brief intros because all of these people have published so many books that we would be here forever if I listed them all. Then, Walter's being very helpful by putting them behind him. So although that is like a fifth of the number of books he's published. So there's really quite a few more. Then up at my top right screen, I'm not sure if it's the same for everyone, we have Ellen and Delia. In alphabetical order, I'll introduce Delia Sherman first. Delia is the author of numerous novels. I think the first one of hers I read and loved was The Porcelain Dove, which is a beautiful novel of manners. Is that a fair characterization? Maybe. Yeah. Yep. She has also written wonderful children's work, and she has co-written with Ellen, her wife, in the Riverside Tremontaine universe. Yes, lovely ring, beautiful, and has written in other shared worlds as well, which she's going to tell us more about. Ellen Kushner, I have been reading for a very long time. I fell madly in love with her novel Swordspoint when I first discovered it, about two gay swordsmen, Alec and Richard, who I still just like, they make my heart go pitter pat. So in Riverside, and I was lucky enough to get to write as part of her shared world Tremontaine for Serial Box. So we'll talk about that. And then back to Walter, Jon Williams, who is another Wildcards writer and has written many series, some genre, some non-genre. You did some ocean-going kinds of series, right? If I'm remembering correct. Oh, Walter, you're muted if you are saying something.
Yeah, I started out at writing historical fiction, and that career collapsed after 5 books. I had a 10-book series planned, but I just recently sold the audio rights.
Nice.
To those 40-year-old novels, which I never expected to do. So there may be a little mini revival of the Privateers and Gentlemen series.
That is awesome. Yeah. And I just interviewed Walter yesterday, and so that interview with him talking, he did a little lesson for us on some writing elements of craft that will be up on the SLF's YouTube, etc. channels within a few weeks, hopefully, as soon as Darius has a chance to edit it. So thank you again for doing that, Walter. So I'm going to try and serve primarily as moderator, and I'll start by asking questions. So my first question is has to do with how shared worlds are put together and how they're kind of how the process works, because I would say, having written in both Tremontaine and Wildcards, it's very different, very, very different. So so let's say that your shared world is going to be working on a new book together. What's the first steps in that process? And yeah, just kind of like talk the readers through it, and keep in mind that some of the people attending may be interested in starting their own shared world or participating in an established one. So that might be a factor in kind of like how they're looking at this and framing this. So, and I'll start with, I don't know, I'm going to start with Ellen, and how you invite people into, and how we organize things for Tremontaine, which may have changed since I wrote with
No. We did 4 seasons and then we stopped. I mean, the fact is, I can't tell you how to start from scratch.
Sure.
Because it's based on a world that I'd already written 3 novels and countless short stories about, which is the world of Swordspoint. I did work on the Shared Worlds Borderlands series and Bordertown series with Terry Windling in the 80s, as did Delia. And we made that all up from scratch. And really, I mean, it's interesting because that was before there was the internet. So it all happened manually. Even long distance phone calls were expensive. So it kind of happened through letters and stories and editing. But the nucleus for that was Terry Windling, who I think sent us all some descriptions of this world that she had in mind, which was going to be kind of a combination of the black leather jacketed street punk world that we were, all of us 20-something writers were living in at the time, and elves and motorcycles and magic and runaway kids, all very powerful things to put together, and many of which were in the lives of some of the writers that she chose, including herself. And so we sort of, I think people just talked over what story they were going to write with her based on these parameters, and then they would send them into her, and then she would edit the living hell out of them so that they agreed with each other. And also, you know, if somebody was straying too far from the concept, that would, you know, she would kind of rein them in. And then as subsequent volumes happened, we built on each other's stories, you know, because somebody would create a part of town, and then you could set your thing in the part of town that that person had created. And, you know, even characters were allowed to be shared with Terry kind of at the helm. Now, the really collaborative fun thing about that, which we ended up doing in Tremontaine, the stuff based on my books, even though we hadn't intended to, was how you bring the strengths of the writers to bear on this collaboration. You know, that we brought in people with, like in the first season of Tremontaine, Melinda Lowe knew a lot about economics that nobody else did. And when the plot hinged on economics, she was really the one who made it tick. And I'm trying to think now. Mary Anne, you brought in, you know, I am here from a foreign land and I'm going to make a life for myself. And actually in season 1, Elia Dawn Johnson created one of the main one of the main characters, one of the 2 really guiding main characters of it, which was a woman who came from not Mexico and not the Mayan Empire to my little European city. And her entire culture, language, it was very complicated. What Elia created was based on the fact that she was in grad school in Mexico City studying all this stuff. And we just kind of went, great, bring it in, tell us how to work with it, and we will. And then I hope I'm not doing the whole panel right now. The other point of this being that despite the fact that in the case of Tremontaine, technically it was my world, I ran it, I got to decide everything. When somebody had created, or Joel Derfner in the first thing, created this just incredibly randy gay man, who wrote him as a gay man, not the way that a lot of women write gay men. And it's like, Joel, you're a gay man, you created this character, we'll go with that. And that character kind of became his character. The woman from the not Mexico was Elia's character. And so when we were all writing them, we would ask, you know, would your character do this? Or could you fix this language? And we didn't realize that was going to happen. And it made it extra super collaborative. And the same thing happened with the Bordertown world.
That's very cool. Delia, do you want to jump in at this point?
Well, I did the editing for the first season of the Tremontaine, and what I did was I got a Bible where we all agreed on certain facts and a certain timeline and certain character traits and places where things happened. And I tried to make sure that everybody was working in the same city, pretty much. and every once in a while, if there was something that was too much of an anachronism in the language, because we were trying not to write oldie Englishy, but not to be too obviously modern. So I smoothed out a little stuff like that, but it was really interesting because you could see the entire map, and trying to make sure that you were using the same map was really interesting.
Speaking of maps, it was absolute torture for me because I've got the city in my head. Like, I just follow the characters around on the ground. I've never gotten the view from the air.
I drew a map.
And I think I drew one and gave it to you or something, but suddenly there had to be a map, and suddenly I had to have answers to all these questions that I had never thought of myself. And it pinned me down in ways I didn't like being pinned down, but it was absolutely necessary if you're going to do a collaborative work.
So I have all kinds of questions, but I'll add in before I switch to the others that one thing I was trying to get at that I probably wasn't clear in my question was just the pure format of like how it worked when we started a book. So at least for the season I was in, season 2, Serial Box, the publisher, flew me into New York, right? So we all gathered for a weekend at Lynn and Delia's and hashed out the entire season, right? Big whiteboard, I think it was a whiteboard.
Yeah, we had whiteboards, yeah.
And colored markers, and talked about it, argued about it, then started plotting once we had the basic idea down, and mapped out season chapter by chapter essentially. And by the end of the weekend, I think we had assigned who was writing which chapters.
Yeah, yes. We all horse traded who was going to write which chapter. It was very funny to watch people manipulate like a Christmas grab bag of who was going to get what. Let me just say that when we say we all, it was you, me, Joel, Tessa. I'm just trying to say it wasn't 18 people. It was
right.
5 or 6.
Yeah, that's right.
Was Karen Lord there?
No, she didn't come till 3. Yeah. Rocheline Maltese. So, but I think 5 or 6 people, and we had a ringer. We always had somebody kind of come in and write 1 or 2 extra episodes, I think, because we had to do it really fast. So it was a smallish team.
Yeah. So, and it was interesting because we kind of we did the weekend, which I think must be somewhat similar to a writer's room in Hollywood and how it works. And then we all went home, and over the next several months, we were scheduled to write our chapters at various points, and we were in communication at various points. And I'll say one thing I found particularly challenging about that was that I have a terrible memory. And so even with the series Bible, which is very helpful having that, it was hard for me to hold on to details from chapter to chapter over months. And one thing I remember thinking about at the end of that process is, well, if I were ever going to do this, I would try to find people who could commit to like doing the whole thing in a 2-month process, right? Like people who are available over the summer and say like, we're going to be working on this thing for June and July and beginning to end, and then be done. That would be much more manageable for me. I realize a lot of writers would be like, hell no. So, but it was interesting. It's interesting to kind of think about the different aspects. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to David. So David, do you want to talk a little bit about how Wildcards works when we're starting a book?
Well, I think Walter Jon can and should talk about how Wildcards got started in the first.
Oh yeah, do you want to start it that way, and then we'll go back to David? Maybe.
Actually, yeah, I think that would be good because Walter was there at the beginning and I was not.
Right. Okay, so in the early 80s, somebody gave George R.R. Martin a role-playing game called Superworld, and he ran it obsessively for the next couple of years. It was basically a superhero adventure book, and he was just obsessed by it, and the rest of us had to be obsessed by it because he was obsessed by it. And so we played this thing like every week, sometimes twice a week, for a couple of years, and then George realized that he had no income because he'd been devoting his entire life to this role-playing game, and so he I think it was actually Melinda Snodgrass who came up with the idea of it being a shared world, because at that point there had been only one shared world, well, in the last 40 years, which was Thieves' World, and Robert Asprin at TheseWorld was very good to us and gave us a lot of information and a lot of advice about how to set this up and how to do the master agreement that we all had to sign. Basically, it was a sort of, a lot of it was a continuation of the group that was doing the RPG, with other people added, such as Howard Waldrop and Edward Bryant, who were brought in because they were very talented and very individual writers, and George knew and liked them. But the sort of core group dominated things for quite a while, because we would meet regularly anyway for our various social activities. And we were all in our 30s, and we were all writers, and we were all very ambitious. And so we talked obsessively about this shared world system and helped to bring it into being. And it was a tight group of friends. Even if Howard Waldrop lived in Austin and we all lived in New Mexico, and even though Ed Bryant lived in Colorado, we were still good friends. We all knew each other. We all hung out together whenever possible anyway. There began to be an annual, sometimes biannual wildcard dinner, which was held at the Worldcon or at the World Fantasy Con, and the publisher would foot the bill for it. And we'd all get together and we'd brainstorm madly for the next book or the next trilogy or whatever. And it sort of continued in that way. More players were added, more writers were added. Some people were added who weren't writers, but who got to create characters because they were part of the original RPG. Our friend Royce Weidman was a player, and he created some characters, but he never was a writer. And so other people have been using his characters with his permission ever since. And so eventually George went to Hollywood and stayed there for like 10 years. And Wildcard sort of slowly fell into abeyance. And then George came back from Hollywood and he decided to resurrect it with a whole lot of new writers and a whole lot of new scenarios. And maybe David could take it from there, because I think he was one of the first generation there, weren't you?
I think I was among that first generation. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had read the first Wildcards book came out when I was in college, and I was a big fan. And so as I started to become more sure of myself as a short fiction writer, I had the gall to go up to George R.R. Martin at a Worldcon and say, hey, I've got a pretty respectable writing career here. Do you have any openings in Wildcards? I had no idea what the process was, and he said, we're not open at this time, but thank you for your interest. And then like a year or 2 years goes by, and he comes up to me at another Worldcon, as I recall, and it was, hey, you said you were interested in Wildcards. Well, here's what the process is going to be. So we need you, in order to demonstrate that you can work in this world, I'm going to ask you to create a character. So I sketched up a character, and he said, okay, well, here's why this character won't work. And George, Wildcards definitely has George as a single definitive figure at this point. It definitely came out of a group, but George and Melinda have been running the show, and basically George has the whole series Bible in his head. Anything that George doesn't know, theoretically, if you've been with the project for a while, you have this 3-ring binder of in more recent days, printed out emails of character sheets that all the various writers have created. And also, by the time I came along, there were gaming source books, and there was a wiki, and there were web pages, and there were all sorts of already published reference information that I was able to use in order to write my own stories. And I have had the opportunity and the responsibility of kind of slotting my stories in between existing stories, because the first Wildcard story I wrote was an additional story, a bonus track, when they reissued volume 1. So they reissued volume 1 with 3 new stories, and I got to write one of those. And then they've done that with some of the other earlier books. In addition, they're going forward with new books. So I had the opportunity to shoehorn my own character into the past where he'd never been before. I've also written new characters going forward, and I was very very honored to have the opportunity to write a story from the point of view of Sewer Jack Robichaud, who was Ed Bryant's character, and I got his approval to write the character before he passed on. So I'm very honored to be participating in the universe, not only in adding my own characters and my own stories to an ongoing universe, but actually being able to pick up and write somebody else's character, which is a huge honor that I would probably never have been able to have if I was not part of this shared world.
I think it's very interesting. People ask me sometimes, how do you get into wildcards? Like how would I become one of these wildcards writers? And I didn't know that you had just gone up to George and asked him, David. That's great. I admire your chutzpah there.
And here's the thing:
Carrie Vaughn sent him a fan letter when she was 12.
Yeah.
And it's still in the files somewhere.
And
that's how he got to know her. And later she was invited.
Somebody asked me a while ago, how did you get into wildcards? And I told them, I said what I said, and I realized that saying "do as I did" is not good advice for people who don't have my advantages. I recognize that was. I said to someone at this convention at ICFA a couple of years ago, who was having trouble working up the energy. She was having trouble working up the self-confidence to submit, and I said, act as though you had the self-confidence of a mediocre white man, and I am that mediocre white man.
You're not so mediocre, but anyway.
But the thing is that I had both the confidence and the privilege, honestly, to be able to walk up to George R.R. Martin and say, "Hey, guy, any room for me?" Which a person who did not have my advantages going up to that same kind of powerful editor would not necessarily have achieved the success that I did.
Yeah. So my way in was very different. And so I'll talk about that just a little bit. For wildcards, George was looking to diversify. I think this was with the relaunch. He wanted to bring in new writers, and he was actively wanted to make an effort to diversify the writer pool. And so he asked around for recommendations, and Daniel Abraham, who some of you may know from his work on, he's one of a team of 2 writers who writes The Expanse as S.A. Corey. S.A. Corey, I think is what
James S.A. Corey. Yeah.
Right. So Daniel and Ty Frank wrote The Expanse, but he recommended me to George. And that surprised me when I learned it, because I barely knew Daniel, but I had met him when I was founding Strange Horizons. He was one of our early fiction editors who then had to step away before we even launched the magazine, I think, because his writing commitments became too demanding. But somehow in those early interactions, he got a good impression of me enough to mention me to George. So there's a certain serendipity here, and it's no guarantee of anything. I think, these editors still have to like your writing, but sometimes just being part of the community can help get your foot in the door, I guess. George, we have an interview with George on the SLF site where I was talking to him at Dublin Worldcon about epic fantasy, but towards the end of it, he talks about how important it is to go to conventions. And given the last couple of years of pandemic, here it's been a tremendous loss not being able to do that. And I think it has definitely slowed down a lot of this kind of collaborative work. Being able to connect online also makes it possible to collaborate with people who perhaps could never have afforded to go to a convention. So I think there's some really interesting questions to think about as we move forward from this point.
But at the beginning, we had to send Xeroxes to each other.
Yeah.
Right. And at the end, George would make 2 or 3 Xeroxes of the entire volume and ship them around, with a list. When you're done reading it, send it to this person, and so on. And it was, it was that crude. It was that difficult. And now, hey, there are PDFs.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, all of our collaborative work. I mean, I'm a little envious, Walter, of like the idea of like having this great dinner at a con where you hash all stuff out. That sounds easier and more fun than what we do now, where George, what he'll do is he'll come to us with the idea for a new book that he's contracted, and then we'll all pitch to him if we want to be in that book. We'll say, I'd like to do this story with these characters. Maybe characters we've already established, maybe new characters, maybe hopefully using some of the other characters by other writers, because we try to be collaborative in that way as much as possible. And then George reads through the pitches and decides which ones he's interested in and whether you've been accepted to the book. And then we go off and write separately. And some of the books are more integrated than others. And so depending on the book, maybe you're just writing a standalone story, and that works reasonably well. But if you're doing something like Joker Moon, which came out recently, which has an interstitial tying together many decades of material, there has to be, in the end, a lot of back and forth with other writers via email, and it's quite challenging and time consuming, I think. Ellen, yes.
Which is the perfect segue into the crazy collegiality with which we ended up writing Tremontaine. With Walter, you guys, invented it in the first place, but also knew how it was done by the folks by Aspirin and the folks who were doing Thieves World. Yeah. We were doing basically TV without money. When my friend Julian Yap came up with the idea of Serial Box being that it would be entirely online, and you would download a story that was an episode in a kind of HBO-like series every week. And so we had all these ideas, and he did several with Max Gladstone, and then he came to me and said, can I do a Riverside one? And I said, yeah, but I have to be in charge, and it has to start before the books start. And we weren't going to have any costume budget or anything like that, and we weren't going to have any sponsors. And we did, instead of having, a 24/7 writer's room, we had these long weekends at my house for every season. And it was 13 episodes per season. And I always wrote the first one to kind of get things started. But we thrashed it all out and discovered in our first year, to our kind of horror, that even though stories had to sort of be self-contained, the way an HBO episode is contained, that they were basically one long narrative arc, so much more than we had realized they would be. And you want to talk about time consuming. As a result, we sort of had this 24/7 online writer's room. We did it through Slack. People had to do an outline. People had formally, you presented an outline of your story, which everyone then got online on proto Zoom to talk about. And everyone was writing their own stories all at the same time, and the outlines, but your outline sort of depended on the person before you's outline, but you were kind of writing them at the same time anyway, and you would thrash out the problems, verbally when we had these, whatever they were, Skypes or Google meetings. And then once you did your outline and you presented a first draft, but they all had to agree with each other. There was one where two people had written the first kiss of two major characters. There was a little blood on the screen on that one. So, but in between these incredibly intensive meetings on every one of 13 scripts, we had Slack. And Slack, I hope someone has saved it, because they were hilarious, because everybody's very funny, and we just kept having to deal with things that were just completely ridiculous, and we made fun of ourselves and we made fun of the characters, but we also went in and said, did so-and-so have a sister? I can't remember, and stuff like that.
Well, I was going to say that I tried to get, for one of the Wildcards books that's still in progress, House Rules, I tried to get everyone on Slack because I thought that would be helpful, but George didn't want to go on Slack. Like there's tech issues, right? As we keep adapting from tech to tech to tech to tech. Sometimes it's hard to bring people along, and sometimes it's hard to learn.
George is a 20th century writer.
He still uses words.
He writes on WordStar. Okay, and because a modern computer will not run WordStar. He has to have techs who specially adapt his computers so that they will run WordStar.
Yeah. So this
and as Ty Frank said, come to the 21st century, George, you'll like it. But he just won't.
Also, that's pretty significant. Yeah.
I mean, it's a good problem to have to adapt over decades. So it's great that Wildcards has been running so long that we're running into these problems. But
yeah,
go ahead, Ellen. I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
Now, I was just curious to know also how many people at a time are writing a Wildcards.
It varies. So one thing I was going to say is there are different types of wildcard books. So I think there's basically 3 different types. One is the short story collection. One is the short stories with an interstitial tying them together. But one is the full-on Mosaic novel, which is really a co-written novel where all of our names are on it. And we're writing chapters, but it's not necessarily obvious who's writing which chapter. So an example of that would be I'm in Three Kings, which has come out in the UK, but is coming out in the US this year. It's one of our British volumes set in England. And Melinda was the editor on that. And that ran very differently from all the other wildcard stuff I've been in, because Melinda runs a very tight ship, and she got the 6 of us, I think it was, on a phone call all together. Maybe it was a Zoom call, I can't remember, but all together. And we hashed out the bulk of it on that call. And then we wrote it fairly quickly, again, like within a couple months, going back and forth a lot with Melinda to tie everything together, to get all the timeline stuff correct. It was a tight sequence of events that had to mesh up. And so it was, Melinda Snodgrass has written for Hollywood for many, many years. And so she's bringing, I think, her TV room experience to this. And I thought it was really a pleasure. Like that, for me, that was the easiest process-wise out of all the shared world work I've done, even though it was on a much tighter timeline than everything else. It was just very efficient. I wasn't forgetting things in between. I didn't have to relearn things over and over again. So, you know, she's written for Star Trek. She's written for lots of different TV series, and I think she has a lot of experience with all of that. All right, so we're at 3:37. I was going to ask. I was going to turn it to Q&A at 3:45. So let me just ask all of you one more question to answer briefly. Maybe you can answer either one of these or both. What do you find the most challenging about doing shared world work, and what do you enjoy the most? So what is the most satisfying? And obviously your answers tomorrow might be different than your answers today, but in this moment.
Okay, I'll take it. What I like best about it is the brainstorming with other writers, because you can develop so much in that, and you can just bounce off their ideas off you and vice versa. And new ideas will arise and new solutions to problems will arise, and that's terrific. The hardest thing is it's kind of like we're having to write to 12 editors because our master agreement, because Thieves' World developed in a certain way where you were allowed to do anything to another person's character but kill them. So in Thieves' World, it got to be these competitions of what you could do to other people's characters, what hideous things you could do to other people's characters without actually killing them. And so there were people getting sliced up and tortured and nailed into a box and thrown in the ocean. And this went on for a long time. And we didn't want to have that because it became a circus kind of. So basically you have to, if you write a section with another person's character, that writer has to approve of that section. Mm-hmm. And so if you write with a lot of other people's characters, you have to get a lot of approvals. And I realize it's necessary, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but it is tedious to have to do.
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge for a lot of us in it was the fact that we needed to change our minds. We needed to be nimble, because as we wrote what we had planned in our meetings, it turned out sometimes that it was a really knacky notion and it didn't work. And so you had to get all of the people together and say, okay, this plot point is not going to fly and we need to do something with it. And we all have to agree because it's going to affect all of our characters and everything all the way down the line. And trying to do that was both one of the good things and one of the really, really difficult things, because, you know, one person would be very engaged with a particular thing. And then it turned out that because we had made this change, they couldn't do it. And so that was difficult. But the best thing was that we really all got along, and that we all were willing at some time to say, we have this thing that we're creating together, and how each individual feels honored or disregarded or whatever is much less important than we get to do this. And that we get to make it the best thing we do. And if you get to write that climactic scene instead of you getting to write that climactic scene, and it serves the work, then you're happy.
Yeah.
I'd also like to point out that Delia also was a writer and helped develop another serial box series called Whitehall.
It was entirely historical. It was based on the wife of Charles II of England.
The Merry Monarch.
The Merry Monarch.
The naughty Merry Monarch.
Her name was Catherine of Braganza, and she had a lot to put up with.
Yeah. The issue of who gets what scene ended up being sort of unfortunate for me. I was in one of these Mosaic novels, and my character was running throughout. And every time they had a big scene, it turns out somebody else wanted that scene, and the other person got it throughout. And in the end, there was absolutely no reason for my character to be in that book. It didn't affect the action at all.
I'm eager.
So I was inclined to resent that just a little.
Yeah,
I'm sure you were, but we really worked so that didn't happen.
Yeah,
that's an editorial thing.
Well, the thing was, it wasn't intentional. There was no maliciousness involved. You know, it's just that at a case-by-case basis, as this thing was edited over a period of weeks and months,
yeah,
you know, certain decisions were made, and I realized at the end, wait, why am I in this at all?
Because you're such a good writer. But yeah. I do want to answer Mary Anne's wonderful question, but I also wonder if we can take a moment or two to talk about style. I mean, everybody here is a kick-ass writer, but we all write very differently. And the people who've been on my team, you know, Karen Lord and Paul Whitcover and people like that, none of us writes alike either. And we did sort of sort out how that was going to work.
Mary Robinette.
Oh yeah, Mary Robinette for your team. Yeah. Anyway, so for us, each one had to sort of have the same writing style, but not really. And so what is it with wildcards? What do you all do for that?
With wildcards, I'd say that because it's kind of adapting the comic book model of each, basically each character is the main character in their own comic book, which means that generally speaking, every individual story in the anthology style books, every individual story focuses on a single character or a couple characters, and so they may have different voices and different tones. Like a story about the astronomer, you know, is all about you know, ninjas and drug lords, whereas a story about the turtle is more going to be about politics. So each story in the anthology style wildcard stories has its own thing, although they do have to fit together. The Mosaic novels is much more of a matter of people agreeing on a style and a voice.
Yeah,
I never changed my style at all. So
we didn't explicitly talk about agreeing on a style or a voice, but I would say for Three Kings, I tried to write in the more neutral of my styles. Let's say, right? Like I have stories that are, you know, much more attempting various kinds of literary prose whatevernesses, right? And for Three Kings, because I knew it was going to need to mesh with 5 other writers' voices, I went for a more workmanlike prose that would not stand out too much, right? And leaned into characterization and story instead as being the main points of interest. And I think kind of everyone basically did that. So you can, if you read Three Kings, you can probably tell who wrote any given paragraph if you if you are paying attention, but I don't think it's super dramatic in the shifting between them. But it's an aesthetic choice, and it was something that I find a little jarring sometimes with the Wildcards collections, because it is so much like a short story collection where it really does shift dramatically in style from one to the next sometimes. So as long as you just have to go into it with that mindset, it's like a short story, an anthology, not a collection, but an anthology where it can be very different from story to story. Ellen, do you want to answer the question about best worst?
Yeah. Oh, well, I want to tell you how we developed our style for Tremontaine.
Okay.
Because again, we were making it up as we went along. I mean, we'd never done this. No one else had done exactly what we were doing. And again, we sort of tried to use the TV model. Initially, the editors said, everybody has to sound the same. But as it's impossible. B, it was easier than it would normally be, because I remember during that first meeting of the first season, everybody went, so basically we should write like Ellen Kushner, kind of make it sound like Swordspoint. And once you've got a model, it's easy to copy a model if you have a certain kind of brain, but everybody does have their individual styles. And so we were saying, sort of much like as with TV scripts in series, if you're really an aficionado, you can tell, which one's a so-and-so script and which one's a such and such script, even within a series. And then, though, to be fair, I was pretty hands-on in every season, but especially in the first season, I sort of smoothed out every story. For instance, some people were great at description and action, but their dialogue didn't sound like my characters. And so I tinkered a bit with their dialogue. And, here and there I would do things. And I think that having my paw on it did make the whole thing sound more like itself. And it's funny, as the creator of the whole thing, I felt, a certain amount of personal proprietariness with it, and wanted people to have their own voices. But my kind of first hand person, we called her the showrunner, was Racheline Maltese. And she said after a couple of years, it's hilarious what you'll go to the wall for and what you won't. That, things that just bother you, Ellen, could be a single word and you'll make a huge fuss. And then something really huge, like, oh, we'll invent a new country. And I'll be going, oh yeah, well, that's fine. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, for my best and worst, my worst, I wouldn't say worst. I think I've told you this, Ellen, but in case I haven't, one of the toughest moments for me was when I got your first round of edits back, and you expressed yourself very strongly in your edits, using colorful language, and so I was getting these editorial notes like "fuck no," and what? I'm sorry.
I said, oh, that's
I just had never had an editor speak to me like that before. So I realized as I was reading, like, oh, Ellen's not actually mad at me. Okay, it's all right. It's all right. She's having a strong emotional reaction to whether this works or not, and it's not about me. But I had to kind of work through that process.
Were you supposed to see those? Maybe those were being sent to the other editor, and you were never supposed to see them. Oh, good Lord.
Well, I don't know. It was fine. It was totally fine once I realized that you weren't actually yelling at me. I was good. So I will also say copy edits. I'm blanking on the name of our copy editor for Tremontaine season 2. I don't know if you use the same one all the way through. I'm
blanking on her name too, but kind of on purpose. She
is meticulous and very detailed. I've never been copy edited so heavily, and changes in every sentence essentially. And I suspect that may have also gone to smoothing out the style to some extent, if she was doing that to everyone. So I generally agreed with every one of her edits, but it was exhausting.
I cut some of them out. I don't know. Anyway, so that was all going on. And as I say, we were making it all up. So it may be that you weren't supposed to see my fuck nose. I don't know. I don't remember. I really don't.
It's okay.
So totally. Best and worst for me. Best,
and we're going to be quick because we do have some questions in the chat. Great. So quick answers.
Best was getting to work with amazing colleagues, and not just seeing what they did, but seeing how they did it. I learned a huge amount from being down in the ditch, watching, how Karen Lord, for example, could turn out these amazing outlines where she knew how long every scene was going to be. And just knowing a human being could do that and watching as she progressed, it was just a giant education, watching how other people write from start to finish. It was exhilarating.
David, do you want to throw some things in?
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much out of working on Wild Cards, not only the process of collaborating and learning from what the other writers were doing, but being required to make changes that I wouldn't ever have had to do. Like I wrote this one scene for I think it was one of the police procedural ones. I wrote a scene, and then George came along and said, "This is a great scene, but nobody else used this character at all. So we're going to need to rewrite it with a different character." So I rewrote the same scene with another character doing the same job. And it was really interesting to see how they differed, because it was functionally the same, it was structurally the same, but not only the characters' own words, but actually the way that they were described and the actions that they chose to take, I found just had to change. And then as it turned out, the character that I had used was needed elsewhere. So I had to rewrite that scene again with yet a third character, and I got to do it again. And so that exercise, it's actually an exercise that I've now assigned to my writing students, because I found it so useful. Is, okay, now take that scene, take that character out, and write it again with a different character and see what changes. Because it's not just changing the character's name. If you're only changing the character's name, then your characters are too much alike each other.
I do want to add something to this. Delia touched on it, which is that sense of flexibility. I brought in we were both working with theater people. Actually, the woman who created the whole Whitehall thing is primarily a playwright. And I brought in Joel Derfner, who's a theater person, and they're fine with rewrites at a level that nobody I know in the fiction writing community is, because they're very used to going in and being told, like, no, these song lyrics don't work, you have to write new ones, or the scene isn't really working, we're taking it out, and we need something that does this. They have this sang-froid to being told to make major changes like nothing I've ever seen before. And they're all shocked at the preciousness of the rest of us.
Well, I think that was, I think, probably the most useful thing. And for me, and then the advice I'd give to anyone thinking about trying writing in a shared world is not to be precious about your words. You have to go into it with this is only a draft model, right? And we may end up throwing it all out, and that's okay. That, we're working towards getting to something better that you're going to be happier with in the end. And I had a really hard time with that initially when I first came on with Fort Freak, because I'd never done it before. And I had written things, and George would come in and he told me I was being much too nice to my characters. And, thankfully he did not make me kill many of them in a bloody slaughter. But
I'll give him time. This is George R.R. Martin we're talking about.
Right. But he did make me break up my threesome, which I was sad about, but it was correct. It was, in fact, it did not make sense for them to stay together, given how badly one of them had behaved by the other one's standards. And so that, he's a very good editor, and that was really helpful to me, and learning to, I think we're used to taking that kind of edit to some extent from editors, but with these shared worlds, you're also just taking changes because, it's going to work better if I can bring in this person's character more and let them shine a little, let me pull back a little on my character, they've had enough screen time, or kind of starting to think about the whole rather than just your piece of it. So I'm going to transition. I'd like to transition to the Q&A, if that's all right.
We're just getting going. Okay.
I know, but they've got 3 questions here. And so the first one is a very straightforward one, so I'll just answer it, but let you guys chime in if you want. Would people ever agree to kill their own characters? In Wild Cards, we do. I have not yet been asked to kill one of my characters, but I'm sure it'll happen at some point. But we have multiple characters, so I have 4 or 5 major characters I've developed for Wild Cards at this point. So while I'll be sad to see one of them go, it's not as if, that means I'm out of the books, right? So
I believe that question was asked in the context of Thieves World. Yeah. And the answer is that yes, sometimes Thieves World characters would be killed off, as long as the creator of the character agreed that the death would be worth it.
Well, and sometimes a character is born to die. I mean, I know Tessa Gratton set up, I don't want to give any spoilers, but she set up some very wonderful, vicious, horrible people, knowing that their death would be really dramatic and fabulous, 25 episodes later. So yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah. I think if you know that you're planning to kill them off eventually, it eases it a little bit. So that definitely helps. And you do want the stake. We have some of that in Three Kings, and we try and give each other good death scenes, right? Like, if you're going to kill off a character, it's not a casual thing. So you get to go out in a glorious manner, generally. Walter, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I am prepared to sacrifice all of my characters if their death is going to contribute in a significant way. And so far, it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
But I'm open to it.
Yeah. Right. So
Yeah.
I guess in Joker Moon, my character, it's an interstitial where she shows up as a young woman and it goes all the way to her old age. So it's implied that she dies at the end, but off screen. Right. So, okay. So there's a bunch of questions and so on. Let me go back to this. I'm going to go with Tara. Tara asked a couple of questions. I'm not sure if we'll address all of them. When you write for Shared Worlds, do you find you have time to work on your own projects? If so, do you ever find that the universe of the shared world you're working with affects your other stories and pieces? So my answers to that are yes and no in a pretty straightforward manner. I don't know if anyone wants to expand on that for their work.
My answer is no. When I was doing Tremontaine, that's all I was doing.
Yeah, but you were the editor, so that's it. And showrunner and a lot of other stuff. So I seem to have written over 40 volumes of fiction in addition to anything I've done for Wildcard. So apparently it hasn't slowed me down by much. I tend to write short fiction as a kind of palate cleanser between larger projects, so.
Yeah, I do too. I've never written anything longer than a short for Wildcards. And so that is the sort of thing that I will do kind of in between bigger projects. And stylistically, I don't see any overlap or effect on my other work.
Yeah, I guess I would say the Mosaic novel, I was mostly working on that when I was working on that, but that was, again, I think we did the whole thing in a 2-month period. So the short stories, I just sort of fit in between other things. So, okay, what's the best way you found helps ease the sting of not getting the scene story you want? Or
alcohol.
Similar situations. Thanks, Walter.
Alcohol works great.
Some of the people here are undergraduates, so I will just note that I'm not advocating that my students who are underage drink, but
wait till you're older.
Well,
you guys can tell them, but their professor cannot. So, but
I believe in whining.
Yeah. Whining is good.
Bitterness, long-term bitterness.
Well, no, short-term bitterness. You just have to whine a lot, and then it gets it right out of your system.
I would also say, talk to your editor, because it's a little bit like being in relationships. Like a lot of times people don't ask for or bring to the surface things that they're feeling, and the editor is juggling a ton of different stuff, and they may not have noticed until fairly far into the process that your character is kind of slipped off stage. You could bring that up, you can mention it to them and be like, hey, this feels like I'm becoming less and less important here. And it is a long process, and sometimes we are not as cognizant as things as we would like to be, and whatever else. Hopefully you have a good relationship with your editor and are confident enough that you can have these conversations with them. I think I could have said that to you, Ellen, if I was feeling like my character was unhappy, was being not treated well. So I probably would have been too nervous to say anything like that to George when I first started with Wildcards. But at this point, decades in, I think I could. So, all right. Darius asks, I'm interested in how themes are tackled as a whole. Is there an agreed upon theme that all writers should have to tackle depending on the project?
Thoughts? And then Tara had a follow up on that one. We can tackle those both at once because we're low on time.
Oh yeah. And Tara says, how do you deal with disagreements on what those morals themes should be? Interesting. Okay. Anyone want to take a stab at it? I'm not sure we had themes per se. We had
I think themes arise organically, but what we have is an arc. We have an overall arc for the, and you're pretty much free to elaborate anything. The themes are individual to the characters, I think, more than anything. They echo one another. That's great,
But many of the
know,
wildcard books do have explicit themes. There was the horror one, there was the comedic one, there was the murder mystery one, and these themes are basically something that when George and Melinda create the request for pitch, they'll say, this is going to be a dark, horrific book, or this is going to be a lighter, more humorous book. So the theme is something that everybody knows about going into the project from the beginning. Other projects do not have strong themes like that.
I might call that more tone than theme. Because, and I'm going to just make that contrast, because I do think some of the projects have themes, like Tremontaine season 2. I think a big theme was about power and like power behind the scenes and the rise of this woman to power and how other people were negotiating power or lack of it in their relationships and their status in the city. So and then in Three Kings, very similarly, it's about British royalty and who's going to inherit the throne. And so that one also, power, legitimacy, what are you willing to sacrifice? Who are you willing to hurt?
But are you talking about after the fact? You didn't go in going, this will be our theme.
Well,
no, we did. I think it was in the initial discussions, right? In that first brainstorming session.
Do you remember?
It seemed, what I remember is that it became very clear very quickly that a lot of the writers had very strong personal themes and agendas that they were very interested in. So we had people who were really interested in talking about how power works, what it's like to be poor, how the poor negotiate vis-a-vis the powerful people, and how they get some kind of autonomy and power for themselves. And especially since in a way it was a rags to riches story because of the central character, I think that became, we did not necessarily agree on it overtly, but it was very clear that that's what we had written. By the time we got to the end of the weekend, it really was a Tamburlaine comes to power story. And it was, and with a lot of emphasis on economic differences, on class issues, on race issues. And it really, because these were things that all of the writers were really interested in. So it was going to be there. It was completely organic, but we agreed on the ways in which we were going to tackle them by the end of the weekend.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add, like, I think I took my cue a little from Ellen's character, right? I think there are many things I could have and would have enjoyed exploring in the Swordspoint universe, but once we had her arc, kind of like we'd sort of figured out what was happening there, I think I was started thinking in relation to that, right?
We had a main character.
And yeah, and so that then made it easy for us all to develop things that kind of went with that, if that makes sense.
And when you're writing a lot about politics, what you are talking about is who has the power and who gets to make the decisions. And they're all political stories. So, you know.
Yeah. And George does sometimes set the theme for even the collections, I want to say. Does that seem right to you? He talks at least a little bit, like with House Rules, he wanted certain kinds of stories, right? And he gets perhaps frustrated when he doesn't get them from the writers, which he doesn't always. I don't know if either of you want to address things like that that have come up with your pieces. So, sorry, I meant Walter.
Yeah, I have. If George ever gets specific like that, either I will be happy to write those themes or I won't be, and if I really don't feel like tackling them, then I won't. You know, I'll work on some other project. But
yeah, that's true. I don't pitch for every Wildcards book.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
well, and I don't pitch for everyone, and also the ones that I pitch for, I don't always get. sometimes George and I will go back and forth on an idea. In one particular case, I'm thinking of, I had what I thought was a great idea for a story, and George didn't want to do it. And we kind of went back and forth about each trying to find a way to warp the story into something that would fit both of our desires. And I think it eventually came down to, I was not interested in doing the story that he was trying to create. So we wound up
Could you do it for Tor.com?
Hmm? No, that was for I don't remember which Wildcards book it was, but I wound up not writing the story. We never came down to it. Was the sleeper one. I wanted to have the sleeper turn into a creature that ate dogs. My character Eddie was going to try to help him deal with the fact that he was doing this incredibly anti thing, and George basically said, we can't have Croyd eating dogs. Nobody likes somebody who eats dogs, and he's supposed to be a sympathetic character. And so I tried changing him into a creature that ate rats instead, and it just didn't have the resonance. We did not wind up figuring out a way to make that idea work at all. So I did not have a story from that book.
All right. So this was originally scheduled to go till 4. I'm going to cut things off at 4:15. So if you have any last questions, audience members, please do throw them in the chat now. And if I don't see anything there, I can just let these guys loose, and they'll just keep saying interesting things until 4:15. So I'm watching for questions. I don't see any right now. I'm thinking about, let's say you're setting up a shared world. If someone was going to set up a new shared world, any advice that you have that you want to throw in? Oh, Morgan asked, what were the 3 types of wildcards again? Did you mean what happens with the wildcards, or do you mean the 3 types of wildcard
books?
So the 3 types of books were the just short story anthologies. For example, Deuces Down is one that's all about people with very minor powers, and that's the theme that joins it all together.
Puddle Man being an example.
Yeah.
His ability to turn himself into a puddle.
There you go. Right.
Yeah.
So I think I've got a character who can teleport 3 feet in a random direction. So he doesn't know when he activates his power where he's going to end up, but it'll be 3 feet away, right? So potentially useful, perhaps potentially not. The interstitials are similar, but they have a plot arc. They have a interstitial story that someone comes along and, after reading the short stories generally that have come in, write something that ties them all together. I tried to write an interstitial once, and it was very early on in my wildcards experience. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. And I ended up passing it off to another writer because I was like, this is very challenging and I'm not ready to do it. The Mosaic novels are supposed to read like a novel. So you're plotting it all together. You're working out all the details together. You are still, I think we were generally alternating chapters and points of view, but it should be a pretty coherent reading experience. Okay, so two more questions I'll squeeze in. What advice would you have for anyone creating their own shared universes? And then Emmanuel Henderson asks, being in a shared world means being sometimes very close to the main story or far from it. As a writer, telling your own character within the larger story, is there an ideal place to be? So.
Okay, to answer the second question first.
Yeah,
if your character is close in theme and story to the overall arc of the book or of the series, then that's an ideal place to be, because your character's story and the story of the arc can play off each other in interesting ways. As for the first question, if you want to start your own shared universe, prepare to lose years of your life.
So I want to just add one thing onto Walter's, which is that we do have at Tor.com has been publishing wildcards stories and novellas. So sometimes you can have spin-off individual stories that are not part of one of these books. And that is a great place to explore some some side story of your character that is not going to be tied to the main arc of a book.
I would like to talk about the other way of doing things, where with Tremontaine and Border Town and everything I've worked on, you didn't just own character and walk them around. If you created someone in the world, you felt a little proprietary about them. In Border Town, you tended to write about them exclusively more, but not always. But in Tremontaine, there were characters already existing. There were characters we made up together, and you didn't always own one. It was relaxing to do the funny little side characters, to create in this sort of Dickensian way for your story. You say he goes and buys a sword from somebody. And if you can make the person he sells him the sword, who's got, 2 lines in a paragraph, incredibly fun to write, that's a joy all in itself. And sometimes people would do that, and we would love that character so much that we had a woman who sold used clothing, and we needed someone to buy used clothing, but we all loved her so much that we kept going back to her shop, and everybody wanted to write that character. And other times
she ended up being incredibly important.
Yeah, she ended up in the plot because she was so much fun to write. So I think sometimes you don't want to be in the center, and sometimes you don't go back to that person. You just have a really good time writing some really strong, outrageous, not necessarily funny, it could be not funny, but very strongly flavored character who isn't integral to the plot. And there are fewer stakes. You can kind of push it farther, because if they don't have to come back, the stakes aren't high. You can do whatever you want.
David, do you want to add anything?
I was just thinking about the cabbage seller in Avatar, who is this incredibly minor character. I mean, he was literally in there for one gag, and everybody liked it so much they brought him back for 2 other episodes, or maybe 3. And in the subsequent follow-on series, he became the founder of an entire dynasty, just because he was this
cabbage seller.
Cabbage seller.
Yeah.
Nice.
Seller. What happened was that he was one of those guys in the marketplace that had his stall knocked over by the chase scene. My cabbages, and it was just. He just became a fan favorite.
Yeah. The other thing that's really cool about doing these is that you can interact with the fans while you're writing it. In your case, it's a very long going series. In our case, they were coming out once a week, and we started to get responses from people about fans or about theme. And we did do some things because of those. Somebody's asking me a question.
Yes, I was going to just say, we have one last question, and then I have one closing thing I want to add. So Ellen, was it more enjoyable to create in your already developed world, or to create in one that's being made in real time?
The latter, I would have to say. I've already done my existing world, and I liked playing in it, but the excitement of seeing all these other brains coming in and playing in my sandbox and bringing new toys was really cool for me. And there are people for whom that would not be true, but I turned out to be one of God's own collaborators. And I mean, I kept my thumb on it a little bit. People didn't always get to do what they wanted exactly the way they wanted to do it. So, let's not kid ourselves. But when people brought things in that I loved them tremendously. And when I was being a little, controlly, I hope in the end everybody was happy. It was just fun. And it's also fun when it's your world originally, not to have to do all the heavy lifting. You basically got a whole bunch of buddies and you're all building that, that snow castle together. It was really a delight.
So I was just going to add, to close things off, if you are thinking of doing your own shared world, one thing you do have to think about a little bit is copyright, who owns the rights to everything, and what happens if someone works in the world for a while and then leaves, but their characters are still being used by other people. It can be a little complex. Wildcards has a very well thought out, I think, setup where every time your character is used by someone, you get some shares. And if you use them in a major way, they get, or anyone uses them in a major way, you get more shares. George kind of apportions the shares. Shares are distributed for other things. And at the end of the year, everyone's got their distribution of shares in the universe. And so if there's been something like, a comic book deal or a TV thing or whatever else, someone options something, we all get a chunk of that, which is really lovely for kind of the long-term feeling like our intellectual property is being respected, and we stay very invested in the project. And I was just thinking at the start of this, Tremontaine seems like a very natural TV series. I'm about to start watching the new season of Bridgerton, and it just seems like now is the time where somebody should jump on Tremontaine. But I realized, like, oh, I don't know if that happens. Do I get any money? I'm not sure. I don't remember what the contract looks like.
We'll
So
talk later.
that's right. And I trust Ellen, so I'm sure it'll be fine. But it's good to iron these things out in advance.
Let's get the thing made first. No, you're right. No, it is very important. And there were contracts that went into all that. Absolutely. Don't go in on a handshake.
Right. So if any of you get to the point where you're like, yeah, I've got like 6 people and we are really going to do this and we're doing it seriously, and gosh, now we need a contract. George has been very generous with, when I've asked him, just sharing the Wildcards contract as a template. He says since the Thieves World people gave him their contract and he used that as a jumping off point, it seems only fair to keep passing it along. So please feel free to contact me if you get to that point, and I'll check with George, and assuming it's okay, I will probably be able to share that on as well. It's not anything private, right? So you could look at it and think about which parts would you want to keep or not going forward. Okay, last thoughts from any of the panelists, and then we'll close off. So I'll start with David.
Working on Wildcards has been probably the closest I'll ever get to working in television. I love being able to rub my brains against all these other marvelous people, and it is absolutely an amazing opportunity. And I would encourage you to seek it out or put one together yourself.
Excellent. Yeah, you should definitely read some first. So, Walter?
It has been a part of my life for nearly 40 years. It's part of my identity now that I am a Wildcards writer. I created these characters that are still living in this other world. And that's pretty great. That's a great legacy to have.
Excellent.
If you're going to do something like, well, the shared world Delia and I did was to write a novel in the Riverside world together. And when I did Tremontaine, and when I've worked with Terry Windling on Bordertown or with Holly Black on Bordertown, the other thing you need to do along with your economic agreements is who has input and who has final say. And you must decide that ahead of time, or there will be blood on the walls.
Yep. I would say Jed and I Jed, who I date, tried to write a short story together, and within 2 hours had a huge fight, like a really serious fight. And we were like, oh, we're not going to be collaborating on this. Okay, good to know. So Delia, last thoughts?
I think that you need a strong central vision. It doesn't have to be real specific, but it has to be specific enough so that everybody knows what it is that they're signing in on. And I think that George's idea that everybody gets some kind of little wild card talent is wonderfully fertile, because there's so many possibilities, and there's so much imagination that can go into it, and a lot of people can put stuff into it. But if it's too rigid, if you get something that's too rigid and too narrow, then it's not you. You don't have that kind of input, and everybody has to feel as if they've got ownership of something in the project. But it needs a structure. It needs something very strong that you know that you're going to work in. And that's the important thing.
All right. And my very, very last question, if each of you could recommend one book, if someone wants to go and read a shared world, there's lots of places you can come into Wildcards, for example. So, and also lots of places to come into Tremontaine, et cetera. So, okay, same order again, quickly. David?
First Wildcards book, just called Wildcards.
All the way back to the beginning. Walter?
I would recommend starting with Wildcards, starting the new series, the revivals, and suddenly I've forgotten the title of that.
Fort Freak. Fort Freak was the first in the. No, that's not what you mean.
No, it was the committee trilogy.
Okay.
Well, anyway,
yes.
There's a possible place to start. But I would recommend actually the first shared world that I encountered, which is called the Floating Admiral. and it came out in the 1920s, and it was put out by the Mystery Writers Association of Britain, in which there was a murder in the first chapter, and they would hand it over to a different mystery writer who did not know this any solution, who would have to work the character through to the end. And it was the first one I saw, and it was quite successful, but I suspect it was so frustrating to work on that they never did another one.
I would say, I see Ellen is recommending Tremontaine at realm.com, volume 1. It's also audio and in print, but I would actually recommend starting with Swordspoint, which is Ellen's standalone novel in Riverside. Read that first and then go to Tremontaine, because I think that's a very interesting transition to think about for writers considering shared worlds. Ellen, do you want to add anything? And Delia?
I actually was going to say something about something that I have just forgotten because it just left my brain.
Bordertown?
Yes, Bordertown. The last Bordertown book was called not Welcome to Bordertown.
The last Bordertown book was the one we did. It was called Welcome to
no,
Bordertown, but the one before that.
Yeah, it was called The Essential Bordertown,
Yeah.
and it was like a guidebook to Bordertown. And since the stories are not necessarily chronological, yes, some of the characters are older now, but you could go back and look at the earlier ones, having had this original this thing that we wrote as an introduction, that has interstitial material. It's done just exactly like you were you were saying. Also, I think it's still in print, so you can get it.
And you co-edited it.
Yeah, and yeah.
And I think I didn't say, I love Bordertown. I grew up on it. I think it's a great read. I love all of those. David threw in to the chat that the Wildcards Committee Triad begins with Inside Straight, which is Wildcards book 18. It's a very long running series. So there's quite a few books after Inside Straight as well. And
my general advice on reading any series is to read them in publication order rather than internal chronology. Because generally speaking, the books that were written early in internal chronology are written to answer questions that if you haven't read the books that were published beforehand, you won't understand.
Yes. So I think that's it. Ellen's thrown in The Essential Bordertown is the title of that collection. And I have now kept my writers quite a bit longer than I told them they would have to be here for. So we're going to close up. We have done a long interview with Ellen and Delia already, which is on the SLF site and YouTube channel. So if you want more, it's part of the podcast, Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Walters will be up soon. And David, I have to schedule an interview with you, so we should talk about that. So thank you all so much for coming. And I hope we see you next week at Building Communities, which will have me and other people yet to be determined. So thanks again. Take care, everybody. That's it.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.